Hello, friends out there in Facebook world. So real quick, I think there's like a lot of people that are going to be transitioning off Facebook, and I'm going to try and do that in phases as well. So this series, I'm just live streaming on Facebook. That obviously is a pretty lousy way to easily archive stuff. So I don't know. The next part, I'm thinking this is going to be a 6-part series, but I'm not completely certain. But I'm thinking part 4, the next part, will be on YouTube first. So I got to I have an old YouTube channel there, but I haven't really used it at all. So I'm thinking that I might just record part 4 on YouTube, but I'm not certain yet. But thanks for joining me. I think this series is really important. Of course, the issue of racism has really never gone away in this country. Of course, this country was founded in many ways on a system of white supremacy, particularly targeting Native Americans and black folk from Africa. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I see a couple people join me, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started because this is really important, and I don't want to drag this on too long. But I think there's an importance of this cannot be overstated because there's a lot of things that have happened recently in the so-called progressive movement, which I call a portion of the left in this country, not the entire left, because the so-called progressive movement I don't think ever really fully included, say, communists and anarchists like myself. More of an anarchist than a communist, really an anarchist socialist. But maybe it should include that group of people too who identify that way. And really, again, like I have stated before, black issues are progressive issues because essentially it comes down to combating a very strong, virulent stream of white supremacy, which is about, essentially when you get down to it, injustice and dehumanization. And progressivism is about humanizing everyone and fighting for justice. So really, black issues are progressive issues. And I will continue to say that because it continues to be the truth. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you all for joining me.
Had been choked out and it was lying down on his chin. I saw that this eye was out and it was lying about midway the cheek. I looked at this eye and it was gone. I looked at the bridge of his nose and it looked like someone had taken a meat chopper and chopped it. And I looked at his teeth because I took so much pride in his teeth. His teeth were the prettiest things I'd ever seen in my life, I thought. And I only saw 2. Where the rest of them had just been knocked out. And I was looking at his ears. His ears were like mine. They curled. They're not attached, and they curled up. The same way mine are. And I didn't see the ear. Where's the ear? And that's when I discovered a hole about here, and I could see daylight on the other side. I said, now, was it necessary to shoot him? If that's a bullet hole, was that necessary? And I also discovered that they had taken an axe and they had gone straight down across his head, and the face and the back of the head were separate.
wanted to know if Mamie preferred a closed casket. Mamie Till said that she wanted to have an open casket and not to do anything to fix up the body because she wanted the world to see what they did to her son. Thousands waited to see Emmett's body, and many screamed and fell out in nervous pain. Mamie allowed spectators to view the body even after the funeral was over. Mamie's courageous acts allowed America to deal with its ugly, racist problems.
Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were arrested for the murder of Emmett Lewis Till. Mamie Till received tons of death threats and vicious letters encouraging her not to attend the trial. During the trial, tons of people came out. As Mamie would walk from her car into the courthouse, spectators looking on would point their guns at her. Pictures of Emmett's body appeared in the Jet magazine, which revealed the ugly monster of racism that America had to deal with.
Just the
Sorry about a little technical delay here. We're going to get going.
Of course, it's what you probably have not seen up to this point.
Well, that's interesting. Here we go.
The cell phone video that drives home the fury that so many people here in Ferguson are feeling right now. It was taken a week ago, last Saturday afternoon. Michael Brown's body is still in the middle of the street after that 18-year-old was shot by a police officer. It was there for hours, uncovered, and a crowd, you'll see them, gather around, and they'll start to respond to police there. We have to warn you that there's a chance that you'll find this video and the audio very disturbing, but we think it's important that you see it. We're not going to speak over it. We want you to hear it and understand what's happening here in this suburb of St. Louis. It's a little more than 2 minutes. Watch and listen.
Up, man. They say he had his hands up and everything, man.
He was trying to get at him?
I don't know. I went out. I just heard the gunshot.
I heard the gunshots from all around. Stay all the way up there.
I knew something happened. It's too early in the day.
Who is the? Do he stay here?
No, it was daddy right there, man. His daddy just tried to go there and they grabbed him. They had in that black t-shirt police talking to him. And that's his auntie right there on the phone. And them screws. No. Yeah, boy, it's dirt. Dirty.
I saw the car.
He gone.
He stood over me.
Yeah, and shot him some more when he was on the ground. Yeah, that's what they said. Shot him some more while he was on the ground. Police killed him. Police killed him, yeah. Said he had his hands up and everything. They still shot him. He fell on the ground. They stood over and shot him some more. They just got him laying in the street dead. Just got him laying.
And so, yeah, there we have images of the body of Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till, remembering the extent of horrific destruction of her son in 1955. And then we have Michael Brown gunned down by police with his hands in the air in summer of 2014. It needs to be noted that Michael Brown's body was left uncovered in the street in the middle of Ferguson, vastly predominantly black neighborhood, for 3.5 hours. So, as you can see, there's people milling about in the background. So, try not to go off my little outline too much, but let me say that's the exact same as lynching. The purpose is to thoroughly terrorize the community. Lynching usually string up people on a tree and leave them there for hours and hours, often days. So a whole African American community can be thoroughly terrorized. So when our empire, our white supremacist empire talks about terrorism, it knows what terrorism is. It really does. So let me try and get back to my outline here. And let me also say that that's why people marginalized and systematically oppressed, violently oppressed communities need safe spaces. Because I think you can figure out why there's widespread mistrust. I think that's pretty easy to figure out. If you really look at the history and look at how this all impacts communities. So I ended off with the end, my last part 2 of this racism for white people. Part 2 ended with the end of the Reconstruction period in the South. So you had Republicans fall out of power in 1876, basically, and Democrats return to power in the South. And so with the end of Reconstruction, actually, blacks lost the right to vote. There was a short period they could actually vote. It led to black congressmen. As I said last time, 2 black senators, I believe from Mississippi. So let me read you a little bit just to sum this up real quick. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1875, so we're still within Reconstruction, just barely still within it, racial discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels, railroads, and theaters was prohibited. Several challenges to the law were mounted in the courts. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled in the civil rights cases that the act was invalid because it addressed social as opposed to civil rights. Now, that's a really weird, vague line, and it's bullshit, basically. Civil rights are social rights. Civil rights are where you can freely go, where you can give business patronage and be treated the same as everybody else and be given the same accommodations as everyone. So the Supreme Court, obviously dominated by white men, said, well, you're addressing social as opposed to civil rights, so they threw it out. Furthermore, the court noted that the 14th Amendment protected people against violations of their civil rights by states, not by the actions of individuals. So there we are, pulling that line is, private individuals can do whatever the fuck they want to and treat people like total shit. For example, when the owner of a hotel refused to rent a room to an African American. In the wake of the decision, state legislatures throughout the South enacted laws that legalized racial segregation in essentially all public places, from schools to hospitals to restaurants. The Supreme Court upheld such Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation in its landmark decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. In this case, the court set forth its famous separate but equal doctrine. You've often heard this, which stated that segregation in itself did not violate the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment provided the facilities for blacks and whites were, quote, equal. Now, how do you ever quantitatively measure that? You don't. So the facilities for black folk were always shitty, totally subpar than the facilities for whites. You can ask anybody that was alive at this period. There still are a lot of people alive this period. So millennials and even some of my Xers that like to play denial and pretend like, oh, that was long, long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Wake the fuck up and you can talk to people that are still alive. So there's that. And I had heard this before, but I had to refamiliarize myself where the name Jim Crow comes from. So when they talk about Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow, the origin of the phrase Jim Crow has often been attributed to Jump Jim Crow, a song and dance caricature of blacks performed by a white actor, obviously in blackface. His name was Thomas D. Rice. He was the most famous one playing Jump Jim Crow in blackface. It first came about in 1832 and was used to satirize Andrew Jackson's populist policies. As a result of Rice's fame, Jim Crow, by 1838, had become a pejorative expression meaning Negro. When Southern legislatures passed law of racial segregation directed against blacks at the end of the 19th century, these statutes became known as Jim Crow laws. So there we have it. So you have the end of 1876, 1877. You have that election 1876, and so that leads to the end of the Restoration, the period of Restoration in the South. The end of Reconstruction did not mean an end to African American political influence in the South, though. Blacks continued to serve in several state legislatures as late as 1900 and were even elected to Congress after 1877, albeit from all black districts. However, a change took place in the 1890s as attitudes about race became more strongly felt, and the prospect of an electoral alliance between poor whites and blacks that could threaten the power structure became a possibility. While the 15th Amendment ensured that African Americans could not be denied the right to vote simply because they were African American, the southern states came up with various ways to disenfranchise blacks, and that's exactly what they did. So in many ways, the political reaction against black empowerment, black equal rights, came under more fire, like the 1890s to the early 1900s. And so you had, more like tests you had to take or different paperwork you had to provide to be able to register to vote all across the South. And in some parts of the North, too. I mean, it's not completely contained to the South here, largely in many ways it was. And this kind of segregation and separate and not equal measures were actually written into some state constitutions here, such as Mississippi's. Mississippi's 1890 Constitution imposed limitations on voting that were aimed primarily at African Americans. These limitations included residency requirements, disqualification of individuals convicted of even minor crimes, payment of all taxes, including the poll tax. Of course, the poll tax was the easiest, clearest way to eliminate poor folk, but it was often directed only at black poor folk, not other poor folk, was the poll tax. And also the other big one that Virginia actually tried to bring back, like a few years ago, a literacy test. So that was the other big one. And yeah, Virginia tried to bring that back, just like, I think it was a way to target the Latino immigrant primarily in Virginia. That came about like within the last 6-7 years. There was a whole brouhaha about them trying to bring back some sort of literacy test in Virginia in order to vote. And loopholes existed within these restrictions to favor whites who might have been otherwise ineligible to vote. For example, an illiterate person who could demonstrate to the register that he understood the Constitution would be allowed to vote. So they had these kind of weird citizenship type tests too. Louisiana adopted the so-called grandfather clause, which allowed men to vote if their fathers or grandfathers had been eligible to vote as of January 1st, 1867. So there you have the good old chauvinist patriarchy at work as well. So all this, 1890s, 1900, you're talking 100, 110 years ago. Not that long ago as far as history. But the fact of the matter is, even if folks could vote, even if people had even equal quality facilities and weren't excluded from staying at hotels and weren't excluded from train cars and so forth, there would still be racism, as there is racism today. So as all these Jim Crow laws were peeled away, you're still left with systematic racism, absolutely equal. And as Jackie said, absolutely, separate was never equal. No, not at all. Not at all. Because of white supremacy. We treat the whites nicer. They're white. So, of course. Definitely. Good point, Jackie. Thank you. So, 1955, you have, there's lynchings all throughout. Actually, lynchings, I think, got to a high point in the 1920s and 1930s. The Klan grew exponentially, I believe, in the 1930s. Again, a time of depression. It leads people to xenophobia, racism, intense racism, and I think lynching sort of got to like a all-time high in the late 20s and throughout the 1930s. I had something here about statistics about lynching. I'm not sure I still have that up. But it was pretty interesting. I wanted to read that, but it was something about 4,752 people were, I remember that number for some reason. I think it's 4,752 people were lynched in the U.S. between it was up to 1968. I'm trying to remember. I think it was 1875 to 1968. About 4,752 folks were lynched in the U.S. and about somewhere between 72 to 75% of them, of course, were black folk. Most of the whites that were killed within that number, of course, much, much smaller, since between 72 and 75% of that number were black folk. The remaining number was mostly white folk. I'm sure there were some Latinos in there, but the white folk were all, the vast majority of the white folk within that smaller number that were lynched were aiding black folk, fighting for black folks' civil rights and human rights, and also white folks that just disagreed with lynching. They were turned on, they were set upon. If they complained and said that lynching was wrong, they would be set upon. But yeah, it was primarily targeted towards black folk to terrorize the community. Like I said, hours and hours and hours, and often days, the body would be left usually hanging from a tree. So, in 1955, you have the lynching of Emmett Till, and it gets a lot of press attention. Major newspapers cover it. That's why I shared the images there and Mamie Till's recollection to honor her wishes, which are so important. I think it's important to get graphic to show people that this shit's real and this shit is absolutely disgusting. And that in some ways it's continuing today. They're usually through gunfire now from police and vigilantes. Let's not forget, say, like Trayvon Martin, that was just some random vigilante dude that saw a black kid wander around his neighborhood in a hoodie eating Skittles. Very threatening, I guess. This guy had an attitude about it. He called George Zimmerman. He called and said, "Oh, these motherfuckers they're just trouble." And then he went out and shot this teenager. So it continues today. So you can, think about that and then think about why safe spaces are really important. There's a lot of mistrust. So you can understand why, And this is serious. This is serious business. And when you deny it and try and turn it around on the people that had organized this safe space and call them racist, you can see how totally fucked up and problematic that is. But I'm not going to keep harping on the one example, so I'm going to keep moving along here. I'll come back to that in subsequent parts. I'll talk about how you can be a good white ally, and how you can fight for justice, for racial justice, which is critically important to a healthy, forward-moving left movement, because justice is a leftist issue. It's primarily the justice issue. Is you can't have greater equality, whether it be racial equality, income equality, so forth and so on, without addressing systematic historic injustices and trying to correct them. That is a left. I'm trying not to say progressive anymore. A progressive cause. It is. That's what popular leftist uprisings are about. Is about redressing historic injustices. So we get to the 50s, and you get the Montgomery, Alabama. I've said Montgomery County because I live next to Montgomery County here in D.C. Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. There was a younger woman, I'm trying to think of her name, one of you guys might say it, who did the bus sit-in. She was 16 or 17. She was still a teenager. And she was a single mom who was unwed. And she did the sit-in well before Rosa Parks. And then they were like, well, this is a great idea. Let's build on this. And so you had Rosa Parks and some other civil rights leaders go to the Highlands Center, I believe, in Tennessee, which is a great sort of civil rights and activist training place. It's still there, the Highlands Center in Tennessee. It's pretty fucking amazing. I want to go there one of these days. I gotta save up money though, because they're like courses and trainings like cost a lot of money nowadays because it's so well known. So Rosa Parks was put forward as a more friendly, family-friendly face than an unwed teenage mom. But can you imagine that teenager to have that amount of bravery to say, no, fuck this, I'm going to break through this wall of blatant discrimination on public buses, So, and then Dr. King came to power as a result of that. He was a very charismatic young preacher who had lived in the North for a while, went to seminary in the North, had his first congregation in Chester, Pennsylvania, where my dad happens to be from. And while he was there, he met Bayard Rustin, who's from Delaware County, the Chester, Swarthmore area. And Bayard Rustin was black, but he was gay, and he was a Quaker. And so he introduced Dr. King to some new ideas, such as the practice of nonviolence, promoted and wonderfully executed by Gandhi in India. So I'm going to read you a little bit of background here, because a lot of people don't know about King's background, and it's he was kind of troubled as a teenager. I mean, he went through some rough times. So let me read you a little bit about Dr. King's background, because it's really interesting. People just know the later King, not what led to the later King, what became Dr. King. So I'm going to read you just a little bit about this. It's really interesting. King was a middle child between an older sister, Willie Christine King, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams King. King sang with his church choir at the 1939 Atlanta premiere of the movie Gone with the Wind. King liked singing and music. His mother was an accomplished organist and choir leader, and she took him to various churches to sing. He received attention for singing. I want to be more and more like Jesus. King later became a member of the junior choir in his church. King said that his father regularly whipped him until he was 15, so corporal punishment was a big thing in both the white and the black community further back in the 50s, 60s, 40s, 30s when King was growing up. A neighbor reported hearing the elder King telling his son he would make something of him even if he had to beat him to death. King saw his father's proud and fearless protests against segregation, such as King Sr. refusing to listen to a traffic policeman after being referred to as boy. Now, a lot of people have heard that story, but not that many. So he saw his father as a very strong, proud, and in the community rather powerful man. So it was a strong role model, I would think. Or his father stalking out of a store with his son when being told by a shoe clerk that they would have to move to the rear of the store to be served. When King was a child, he befriended a white boy whose father owned a business near his family's home. When the boys were 6, they started school. King had to attend a school for African Americans, and the other boy went to one for whites. Public schools were among the facilities segregated by state law. King lost his friend because the child's father no longer wanted the boys to play together. King suffered depression throughout much of his life. In his adolescent years, he initially felt resentment against whites due to the racial humiliation that he, his family, and his neighbors often had to endure in the segregated South. At the age of 12, shortly after his maternal grandmother died, King blamed himself and jumped out of a second-story window but survived. King was skeptical of many of Christianity's claims. At the age of 13, he denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus during Sunday school. From this point, he stated, doubts began to spring forth unrelentingly. However, he later concluded that the Bible has many profound truths which one cannot escape, and decided to enter the seminary. Growing up in Atlanta, King attended Booker T. Washington High School. He became known for his public speaking ability and was part of the school's debate team. King became the youngest assistant manager of a newspaper delivery station for the Atlanta Journal in 1942, and he was 13. During his junior year, he won first prize in an oratorical contest sponsored by the Negro Elks Club in Dublin, Georgia. Returning home to Atlanta by bus, he and his teacher were ordered by the driver to stand so that white passengers could sit down. King initially refused, but complied after his teacher told him that he would be breaking the law if he did not submit. King said that during this incident, he was the angriest I have ever been in my life. A precocious student, he skipped both the 9th and 12th grades of high school. So then he went on to Morehouse College and then Crozier Theological Seminary, right there in Chester, Pennsylvania, and then briefly his first parish was also there in Chester. It was really interesting. I marched most of the first day of the Democracy Spring March back in April, the previous April, and on their march. On the second day, I had bowed out by then, but I knew where they were marching. And then on the second day, it was really cool. I had to go back to the community I was living in Philadelphia, the New Jerusalem Now community. But I watched them on the second day. They had footage of them and a lot of still photos of them passing King's first church there in Chester. And I'm like, yay, that's awesome. And that's where my dad is from. So let me switch to Bayard Rustin, who King encountered in that area, because Bayard is from that area. Let's see, I'll read about Rustin's early life. Yeah, I mean, it's all in that area. Rustin was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania, to Florence Rustin and Archie Hopkins, but raised by his maternal grandparents, Julia Davis and Jennifer Rustin, as the 9th of their 12 children. Growing up, he believed his biological mother was his older sister. His grandparents were local caterers and relatively wealthy who raised Rustin in a large house. Julia Rustin was a Quaker, although she attended her husband's African Methodist Episcopalian Church, AME. She was also a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. Leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson were frequent guests in the Rustin home. Can you imagine? That's a pretty cool place to grow up and be exposed to that. With these influences in his early life and his youth, Rustin campaigned against racially discriminatory Jim Crow laws. In 1932, Rustin entered Wilberforce University, a historically black college in Ohio, operated by the AME Church. As a student at Wilberforce, Rustin was active in a number of campus organizations, including the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. He was expelled from Wilberforce in 1936 after organizing a strike, and later attended Cheyney State Teachers College, now Cheyney University of Pennsylvania. Cheyney honored Rustin with a posthumous, so after he died, Doctor of Humane Letters degree in its 2013 commencement. So I'm getting low on power here, but I just plugged in. So, after completing activist training program conducted by the American Friends Service Committee, AFC, so anybody who's in the peace movement knows about the AFC. Anybody who's done a lot of anti-war work and is serious about it knows what the AFSC is. American Friends Service Committee. Rustin moved to Harlem in 1937 and began studying at City College of New York. There he became involved in efforts to defend free the Scottsboro Boys. You might have heard that. 9 young black men in Alabama who were accused of raping 2 white women. He joined the Young Communist League for a small period of time in 1936 before becoming disillusioned with the party. Soon after arriving in New York City, he became a member of 15th Street Meeting, the Quaker Meeting House there in Lower Manhattan, of the Religious Society Friends, which is the official name for Quakers. Rustin was an accomplished tenor vocalist, an asset which earned him admission to both Wilberforce University and Cheyney State Teachers College with music scholarships. So they're both good singers. So maybe that's how they met. I don't know. They both enjoyed singing. Well, they met where they met was during King's first parish there in Chester, Pennsylvania, which I'm proud to say, my dad is from. The whole, Rustin King connection there. So 1955, you have the Emmett Till incident. 55 to 57, you have this buildup in the South of the early anti-segregation work and the Montgomery bus boycott. Rustin took leave from the War Resisters League in 1956 to advise Minister Martin Luther King Jr. of the Baptist Church on Gandhian tactics. So, as a Quaker, which is a pacifist church, and just a really smart guy that was familiar with all the stuff that Gandhi was accomplishing, he introduced Dr. King to what's called Gandhian tactics, or what I call nonviolent direct action. And so he did this. King was organizing the public transportation boycott in Montgomery, Alabama at the time, which became known as the Montgomery bus boycott. According to Rustin, I think it's fair to say that Dr. King's view of nonviolent tactics was almost non-existent when the boycott began. In other words, Dr. King was permitting himself and his children and his home to be protected by guns. Rustin convinced King to abandon the armed protection, including a personal handgun. In a 1964 interview with Robert Penn Warren for the book Who Speaks for the Negro, Rustin also reflected that his integrative ideology began to differ from King's. He believed a social movement has to be based on the collective needs of people at the time, regardless of color, creed, and race. So Rustin had a more holistic vision, I think, to a degree. But King, in many of his speeches, say that I'm talking about, the equality of all people. But of course, the emphasis was on desegregation, which is the segregation of his community, black folk, in the South. But in some areas and in some ways in the North as well. So you have the civil rights movement going forward, with Bayard Rustin being a major advisor to Dr. King, and not really recognized until recent years because he was an out gay man, and particularly the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they weren't too cool on that. There was a lot of criticism of King being close to an out gay man in the late 50s, early to mid 1960s. So, and then A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin with King organized the March on Washington in 1963, and really the heavy lifting behind that march was Bayard Rustin. Anybody that or worked on that. You can ask folks like our delegate here, because we don't have a congresswoman, Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton. She has a lot of really wonderful stories and memories of Bayard Rustin, as she helped organize and work on. She was one of many young folks working on the March on Washington, Eleanor Holmes Norton. So you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, 1964, 1965. And so again, black folk can vote again, at least on paper. There's still a lot of challenges to that, especially in Deep South. And still they tried to have a poll tax, and that was finally outlawed, banned. But in some areas they still had something like a citizenship test, asking you about the state constitution. Like, who the fuck knows about their state constitution? I'm sorry, but maybe a little bit about the U.S. Constitution, but I remember... that's true. I grew up in D.C., which is not a state. But I've talked to other people. That people don't really know much about their state constitution. They know the U.S. Constitution. And then literacy tests. And, of course, these citizenship tests, let me quiz you about your state constitution, and literacy tests were targeted almost entirely at the black community. So that continues. Lynching continues. And so you get to the point where in the 80s you have the assassination of, first you have the assassination of Dr. King in 1968. Earlier than that, you have the assassination of Malcolm X in Harlem, New York, and King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The two most prominent African-American leaders assassinated. It's been proven that there was some government involvement in both. In fact, Dr. King, there's a 1998 civil suit that the King family had that awarded the King family, they won the civil suit in 1998. In fact, the judge's decision said there was collusion with the U.S. government in the plotting and execution of Dr. King's assassination in Memphis. So then later on, late 70s, early to mid 1980s, you have passage of affirmative action statutes. And so a lot of white folk start getting like resentful and making a big scene, like, oh, racism is over now. In fact, they're getting chosen for jobs and positions at universities and institutions and so forth over us. So that was the first wave of like this whole denialist, I'll call it denialist, I don't know, argument that racism is over now because we have affirmative action. Which is bullshit, obviously. In the 80s, you also have Jesse Jackson's first run for presidency. The first time I ever volunteered on anybody's campaign was 1984's Jesse Jackson's run for the presidency. Before that, Shirley Chisholm had run as a black woman, 1972 for the presidency. She made it to the convention as well, but she was very much disrespected at that convention. And she felt even the black leadership let her down at that point. And there were fissures within the black caucus, and the whole black political leadership in this country was split. And a lot of black men, actually, she felt disrespected her, and she was not treated well at that convention. Let me just say that. Not at all. Really interesting figure. Really cool video about Shirley Chisholm as Unbought, Unsold. Check it out. Really cool. She grew up in New York. I think her parents were Caribbean immigrants, and when you hear her talk, there's maybe a little bit of a Caribbean accent in her speech. Brilliant. Bayard Rustin, brilliant, often not talked about. More recently he has been, thankfully. And so you get up into the 80s and then the 90s where people this first wave of denial, modern denialism, really, I guess I should say. We're saying that, racism doesn't exist anymore because they got affirmative action, they get preferential treatment, which is, again, bullshit. Anybody who knows anything about the job market and how people are hired is, interviews matter. Seeing the person's face matters. And so there's a huge disparity in pay, obviously between women and men, but also obviously between black folk, Hispanic folk, and white folk. Huge parity. There's black and brown pay, and then there's white male pay. Huge difference. And then you get into, more recently, the election of Barack Obama as the president. And again, then you get the second wave of denialism. Oh, we're in this post-racial America now. Racism doesn't really exist. So the second wave of denialism is, oh, Barack Obama. So we're in this post-racial society. And folks notice that there's a lot of shootings of young black men. But there always were a lot of police shootings and vigilante and security guard shootings of young black men. We got to the era, really starting in 2010, even later 2012, of people with video camera capability on their phones, smartphones with video cams. So things are captured now. And so more recently, that all the protests that have happened, very powerful, important protests of the Black Lives Matter, have led to a lot of jurisdictions say, well, okay, then we'll have the police wear body cams. We'll make that a requirement that they have body cams. And names do matter, Jesse. I do agree with you. So you have Michael Brown killed in 2014. Later that same year, Eric Garner, literally strangled to death by police for selling, they're called loose cigarettes, which every other block in Brooklyn or Staten Island or Queens or even Manhattan, there's at some point of the day, every other block, you're going to see somebody at some point selling what's called loose cigarettes. And what do? They end up strangling him to death in front of people, again, caught on cell phone footage. And at the beginning of this video, I showed the cell phone footage of Michael Brown's dead body lying in the street for, like I said, 3.5 hours uncovered. So there we have it. So that's, a quick run through the history. A lot of denialism happened. The first modern wave of denialism, I would say, would be the affirmative action, late 70s, early to mid 80s. They're getting preferential treatment, or all this. But of course, there's a huge income disparity. There's still racism in the workplace, in universities, in public life, really, continuing. And then the second wave of denialism, I would say, was with the election of Barack Obama. Oh, we have like a black president now. Everything is peachy keen. Obviously it wasn't. And, a black Harvard professor, pretty elitist there, was like confronted by police at gunpoint trying to get into his house up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that led to Obama having Beergate, a glass of beer with the cop and Professor Gates, I believe it was. Yeah, Professor Gates. We're talking pretty elitist black here. Something has to happen to him, a Harvard professor, before the White House has moved to take any action. And so, of course, that didn't lead to shit. And so then Trayvon Martin and all these other really notable cases started happening. And like I said, the advent of the cell phone, I really believe that's it, with the video camera capability, has woken people the fuck up. And now indie media, social media, really taking off. And in some ways, in some segments of the population, it's displacing what's called mainstream media. I often like to call it the corporate media. People are creating their own media and their own communities, and there's more, operations of watching police. And so I'm going to end there, because I said I was only going to go up to 2014. That's when, Michael Brown was murdered and Eric Garner were murdered by police. I want to end with saying that the Washington Post has kept a database. I think the previous posting on my page had 2 links. One was a little bit about what happened after Reconstruction, and the other one was the database of police killings of people, starting since early 2015, like the beginning of 2015, continuing now. And I know in 2015, and the numbers really have not changed at all. In fact, the Washington Post article just came out today saying the numbers haven't changed that much in the rates of black folk being killed by police. In fact, they've done comparisons and, people will say, and maybe this is another part of denialism, people will say, well, the numbers are not that, different. Well, yes, they are fucking different, because the black population is a much smaller percentage of the whole U.S. population. So you have to look at the per capita ratio and the percentage of the overall population. And so unarmed black folk are murdered by police at a rate of 5 times the number of unarmed white folk. And you get to young black males 18 to 29 and young white males 18 to 29. I think it's 6 or 7. The young black male is 6 or 7 times more likely to be killed by police than the white male. So, you also have the police officers that killed Michael Brown describe Michael Brown walking to him, rushing turned out to be bullshit, because there were so many other testimonies saying he wasn't moving towards him at all. He's standing there and had his hands held up high where everyone could see them. The cop lied, and so full of shit, and described Michael Brown as looked like a demon to him. So there you go. You got the whole dehumanization, which is a centerpiece of white supremacy. So I was going to read you part of the Washington Post article, but I can maybe post a link to today's Washington Post article, but it's pretty interesting. I'll just read part of it. Fatal shootings by police in 2017 have so closely tracked last year's numbers that on June 16th, the tally was the same. Although the number of unarmed people killed by police dropped slightly, the overall pace for 2017 through Friday was on track to approach 1,000 killed for a 3rd year in a row. The Washington Post began tracking all fatal shootings by on-duty police in 2015 in the aftermath of the 2014 killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, who was unarmed and had an altercation with the officer who shot him. The ongoing Post project has documented twice as many shootings by police in 2015 and 2016 as ever recorded in a single year by the FBI's tracking of such shootings. So yeah, the FBI tracks all this too, and it has for a long time. A pattern that is emerging again in 2017. And then there's an interesting part here where they talk about black people killed by police versus white folk. Let me see. I think they go into that a little bit here. Wow. Ruffle. One more page. Here we are. So, yeah, the Washington Post has been tracking this. They have this whole database. So I included there a link to the databases, like I said, in my previous posting on my wall there. Yeah, black males continued to represent a disproportionately large share of unarmed people killed, although their share has dropped slightly, from 32% of all unarmed killings during the first 6 months of last year to 26% for the same period of this year. One of those 7 unarmed black males killed was Jordan Edwards. Yeah, this story got to me early this year. Fact up. A 15-year-old high school freshman who was shot in April by police officer in a Dallas suburb. An officer in Balch Springs opened fire with an AR-15, I mean, that's a major firepower rifle, on Edwards and his friends as they were driving away from a party, according to news reports. The department, this always happens too, lied. Initially said the teens tried to back over the officer, but retracted the statement after officials reviewed video of the shooting. Again, video is playing a huge role here. The officer, who is white, has been fired and charged with murder. So there we are. Happening this year. So I said I would only go up to 2014, but obviously this is going on. Obviously, maybe there's like a third wave of denialism that's happening, that's ripping through the so-called progressive movement. I like to identify as a leftist. I don't think I really identify very much as a progressive anymore, and this is the reason why. There's a lot of denialism. There's a lot of people dismissing issues of injustice instead of actually fighting injustice, which really progressivism is about, or it should be about, really. I mean, that's been the essential understanding, is we're righting the wrongs. We're trying to improve the lives of the oppressed, the marginalized. So I'm going to end it there, but I went on way too long. I love all you, and maybe 2 or 3 more days I'll do part 4 of this series. So I'm going to end the history part. Part 2 and 3 were the history parts. Part 1 was why I'm going into this in the first place, a little bit of an intro about safe spaces and so forth, and the reasoning for the series. And so I'm in part 2 and 3. This is 3, history. So next part I'm going to go into more details about white allies, being a decent white ally, and how you continue to educate yourself and, learn people's stories and just develop your sense of empathy. That really is, I think, the most important part, is basic human empathy. So peace, love you all, bye.